The road ahead of me seemed to stretch on forever, an endless strip of asphalt surrounded by the darkness of the night. I was crossing the vast plains of Alberta, carrying an urgent load to the other side of the province. Those long nighttime drives were something I was used to. But there was something different about that night. Perhaps it was the absolute silence around me, or the strange feeling that something was about to happen. After hours of driving, I felt the need for a break. My eyes were tired, and I knew I needed to stretch my legs before continuing. I remembered an isolated rest stop that was a few miles ahead, a place known only to veteran truckers. I decided that would be the perfect place to stop for a while, grab a coffee, and recharge. When I arrived at the stop, the feeling of isolation only intensified. The place was deserted, with only a faint light illuminating the small convenience store and a few spots for parking trucks. I got out of the cab, feeling the cold night air on my face. The silence around was almost palpable, as if the entire world was on pause. I grabbed my coffee, paid the sleepy attendant, and returned to the truck, ready to continue the journey. That's when I saw her. A woman, pale and with a distant look, appeared out of nowhere, slowly approaching my truck. She was dressed simply, but something about her appearance made me shiver. She seemed out of place, as if she didn't belong to that place or time. As she got closer, she asked me for a ride to the next town. My first reaction was to hesitate. I had always been careful about who I let into the truck, especially in the middle of the night. But there was something in her eyes, a mix of despair and sadness that made me reconsider. Against my better judgment, I nodded and unlocked the door for her to get in. She climbed in silently, settling into the passenger seat without saying a word. I closed the door and returned to the road, feeling a tension in the air that I couldn't explain. What started as a simple break in the journey was about to turn into something much darker and more inexplicable. As the truck cut through the darkness of the road, the silence inside the cab was almost deafening. The woman beside me didn't say a word since she got in, just staring straight ahead, her hands resting in her lap. I tried to start a conversation a few times, asking where she was going and why she was at the rest stop in the middle of the night. But she only responded with monosyllables or a slight nod. The tension in the air was palpable, and my unease only grew with each mile. Something was deeply wrong about the situation, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The road ahead of us seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the feeling of isolation grew by the minute. I was increasingly certain that I had made a mistake in letting her into my truck, but now it was too late to turn back. After what felt like an eternity, the woman finally broke the silence. She pointed to an empty field beside the road and, in a low, soft voice, asked to get off there. I was perplexed. There was nothing in that field except tall grass and darkness. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would ask to be dropped off, especially in the middle of the night. I tried to argue, suggesting that I take her to the next town, but she calmly insisted, saying that this was where she needed to be. Against my instincts, I pulled over the truck and stopped on the shoulder. The woman opened the door, got out without saying a word, and began walking slowly towards the field. I watched as she disappeared into the darkness, her figure dissolving into the night until she was no longer visible. I stayed there for a few minutes, waiting for her to change her mind or for something to happen. But all that remained was the absolute silence of the night. With a growing sense of unease, I closed the truck door and returned to the road. The air inside the cab felt lighter now, but the relief was brief. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Something about that woman and her request to be dropped off in that empty field left me deeply unsettled. I continued driving, but I couldn't shake the image of her from my mind. The lone figure walking into the void, as if being drawn by something invisible. The night passed without incident, but the discomfort from my encounter with the mysterious woman haunted me throughout the journey. When dawn finally began to break on the horizon, the tension inside me had not diminished. I decided to stop again at the rest stop where I had found the woman, hoping to clear up what had happened the night before. Maybe the attendant knew something, or perhaps she had returned. When I parked the truck and got out of the cab, the scene looked completely different in the daylight. The stop, which had seemed so grim and isolated at night, was now just a desolate place by the roadside. I entered the convenience store and greeted the attendant, who gave me a curious look, as if expecting an explanation. I decided to ask about the woman, describing her and mentioning that she had asked for a ride the previous night. The attendant, an elderly man, turned pale and visibly disturbed. He stared at me for a moment before turning and pointing to a bulletin board next to the counter. As I approached, my heart raced. The board was filled with missing person posters, some dating back years. And there, in the center, was the poster of the woman I had driven. The pale face and sad eyes were unmistakable. She had been missing for over 5 years. My body froze for a moment as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. How was it possible? I had seen her, spoken to her, given her a ride. And now, I was looking at a poster saying she had been missing for so long. A chill ran down my spine, and the reality of what had happened began to set in. I had transported someone who shouldn't be alive. The attendant, noticing my shock, tried to calm me down, but his words only increased my terror. He told me that it wasn't the first time someone had reported seeing the woman and giving her a ride. There were stories of other truckers who reported similar encounters, all involving the same woman, asking to be dropped off in unexplained places. But the truth was that no one knew what really happened to them, only that these encounters left a lasting mark. I left the rest stop quickly, with a sense that I would never fully understand what had occurred. The road before me, now bathed in daylight, seemed less threatening, but the knowledge that I had crossed paths with something inexplicable haunted me. Since that night, I've never seen the woman again, but the image of her walking into the void with that lost look has never left my mind. And every time I stop at a rest stop during the night, I can't help but look around, expecting or dreading to see that ghostly figure by the roadside again. Since I started driving trucks, I've always had a fascination with storms. Something about their destructive force and unpredictability attracted me in a way I could never fully explain. My name is Simon, and over the years, I developed a habit of photographing storms during my trips. I loved capturing the wild beauty of lightning, dark clouds, and fierce winds. It was as if, somehow, I was challenging nature itself. That night in Saskatchewan, a storm was brewing, and I knew it would be big. The sky was getting darker, and lightning began to light up the horizon with a terrifying frequency. I decided to head towards the storm, certain that it would be the perfect opportunity to capture some of the best photos of my life. The closer I got, the more excited I became. I was convinced that this would be an unforgettable storm. Driving my truck through the deserted roads, the storm seemed to dance around me, as if challenging me to follow it. I was prepared, with my camera ready, and the radar on my phone showed the tornado forming a few miles away. I knew it was dangerous, but that was part of the attraction. The danger was like a magnet, pulling me closer to the storm, while adrenaline coursed through my body. As I approached the epicenter, I realized that this storm was different. The tornado that was forming was huge, bigger than any other I had seen before. The rotation of the clouds was mesmerizing, and I was determined to follow that monster until I captured the perfect shot. The rain began to pound hard against the windshield, and the wind howled around the truck, but none of that stopped me from continuing. I was determined to capture the fury of the storm in all its glory. Then, the truck's CB radio, which had been silent until then, crackled, and an urgent transmission began to play. Another trucker's voice, breathless and anxious, was warning everyone in the area about a hunter in the storms. He spoke of something that chased those who dared challenge the forces of nature, something that wasn't human. I ignored the warning, thinking it was just superstition or some kind of joke. But little did I know that the real danger was just beginning. Ignoring the alert on the CB radio, I continued chasing the tornado. The excitement of capturing those incredible images outweighed any fear I might have felt. The wind howled around the truck, and the rain fell torrentially, but I kept my eyes fixed on the storm. With every flash of lightning, I saw the tornado forming more clearly. It was huge, a spinning column of destruction that seemed to move with a will of its own, and I, foolishly, was determined to follow it to the end. As I moved down the road, I began to notice something strange. The tornado, which should have been following an unpredictable path, seemed to be changing direction, as if it were following me. Every time I turned, it also changed course, keeping a dangerous but constant distance. It was as if the tornado was aware of my presence and was hunting me, not the other way around. The feeling of being in control began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The CB radio crackled again, but this time, the voice was filled with panic. The trucker was shouting, begging anyone in the area to get out immediately. He talked about the Hunter, an entity that inhabited storms and chased those who got too close. Every word he said seemed to carry the weight of despair, but I still hesitated to believe. After all, it all sounded like an urban legend, a story to scare newcomers on the road. But the situation quickly worsened. The tornado, which had seemed distant before, was now approaching at a frightening speed. I tried to accelerate to get away, but the wind was so strong that it began pushing the truck off the road. The tornado seemed to have a will of its own, as if it was focused on catching me. The feeling of being hunted was undeniable, and panic finally began to set in. Desperate, I turned the truck in an attempt to escape the storm. The road ahead of me was almost invisible, covered by a curtain of rain and debris that the wind was dragging. With every mile I drove, the tornado seemed to follow my movements, getting closer and closer. The CB radio was now completely silent, except for the sound of the wind howling in the background. The storm was alive, and it wanted to catch me. Finally, I realized that I was in a fight for my life. The tornado was almost upon me, and the truck was shaking violently with the force of the wind. I knew I didn't have much time. In a last desperate effort, I turned the steering wheel onto a side road, hoping the tornado wouldn't follow me. That moment was a blur of panic and adrenaline, and all I could think about was escaping, no matter the cost. I managed to swerve onto the side road at the last second, feeling the truck nearly lose control. The tornado passed close by, the force of the wind so intense it seemed like it wanted to tear the truck off the asphalt. But, miraculously, the vehicle held firm, and I kept driving, without looking back, until the storm was far enough away that I could breathe. When I finally stopped, the silence around me was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of the rain now falling softly. As I tried to calm my nerves, the CB radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't the desperate voice of the other trucker. It was just static. I stood there, absorbing what had just happened. The reality of the situation began to set in. I had been chased by something that seemed to be more than just a natural phenomenon. The tornado, or whatever it was, seemed to have an intention, a will of its own. And that will was focused on hunting me. In the days that followed, as I tried to understand what had happened, I began to ask more experienced truckers about the legend of the Hunter in the storms. Some laughed, dismissing the story as superstition, but others got serious and told me what they knew. The legend spoke of an ancient spirit that inhabited tornadoes and storms, chasing those who dared to challenge it, especially those who tried to capture its fury in photos or videos. They say the spirit was a force of nature, an entity that had existed since ancient times, feeding on the fear and adrenaline of humans who got too close. According to the legend, it was drawn to the audacity of storm chasers, those who, like me, saw in nature's destructive force an opportunity to capture something beautiful. But beauty came at a price. Those who were chased by the spirit often didn't live to tell the tale. As I listened to these stories, the truth of what had happened began to sink in. I had crossed a line, challenged something that shouldn't be challenged, and the spirit of the storm, the Hunter, had marked me. Even though I had survived, I knew that the encounter had left a mark on me, a feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the next opportunity. Since that night, I've never approached a storm again. The photos I took that night, before the tornado started chasing me, remain stored away, untouched. And every time I hear the distant sound of thunder, I remember the terror I felt when I realized I wasn't just chasing a storm. I was being hunted by something much older and more powerful. And I know that no matter how much I try to forget, that feeling of being watched will never completely disappear. When I was assigned to cross the National Forest in Nova Scotia on my first long haul, I was anxious and excited. My name is Evelyn, and being a truck driver was a dream I was finally realizing. The idea of driving long roads, especially through such remote and beautiful places as that forest, always fascinated me. I was ready to face the loneliness of the road, with only the sound of the engine and the CB radio as my companions. The night was particularly quiet as I drove down the deserted road. The tall trees, densely packed on either side of the road, seemed to close in around the truck, creating a dark and oppressive tunnel. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, but the darkness beyond the beams of light seemed impenetrable. No matter how much I tried to relax, there was a persistent feeling that something was not right. The CB radio, which was usually a source of comfort, began to emit intermittent static, breaking the silence. It was as if the device was picking up some lost signal, something that shouldn't be there. I tried to ignore it, adjusting the volume and focusing on the road, but the persistent sound of the static seemed to penetrate my mind, creating an unsettling atmosphere. Even with the radio volume low, the static stood out in the forest's silence. Suddenly, in the middle of the static, a faint and almost imperceptible voice began to emerge. At first, I thought it was just interference, but as the voice became clearer, I realized something strange was happening. The voice murmured numbers and names with no apparent meaning. They were like whispers, said in a repetitive, almost hypnotic manner. I tried adjusting the radio, trying to catch the transmission properly, but the voice kept blending with the static, creating a disturbing cacophony. Time seemed to slow down as the voice became clearer. It was no longer a distant interference. Now it was something present, something that seemed to be directed at me. The murmuring of the numbers became more frantic, and the names being said began to sound strangely familiar. The tension inside the truck's cab was palpable, and I felt I needed to stop and understand what was happening. But what the voice was about to reveal was something far more disturbing than I could have imagined. The voice on the radio, once indistinct and mixed with the static, was now clear enough for me to discern the words. It repeated numbers in a sequence I couldn't understand, interspersed with names. The more I tried to adjust the radio to improve the signal, the clearer the voice became. But with that, the feeling that something was terribly wrong also increased. Then the voice did something that left me paralyzed with fear. It called my name. Evelyn, it whispered, in a tone that seemed to come from a distant place, yet at the same time, frighteningly close. My breath caught in my chest. How could the radio know my name? It was impossible. It was as if the voice was watching me, knowing me in a way that left me terrified. The truck seemed tighter, as if the space around me was closing in. The radio kept murmuring my name, followed by other names I didn't recognize, but that sounded strangely familiar, as if I should know them. I started to think about turning off the radio, but at the same time, I felt I needed to keep listening, as if the voice was guiding me to something I couldn't ignore. Suddenly, the voice began to murmur coordinates. They were spoken in an urgent tone, repetitively, as if giving me instructions. Despite the fear, I wrote down the coordinates, unable to resist the compulsion to follow them. Every word from the voice seemed to carry weight, as if something terrible was about to happen if I didn't obey. The darkness around the truck seemed more oppressive, as if the trees were closing in even more, completely isolating me from the outside world. I decided to follow the coordinates without fully understanding why. There was an invisible force driving me, something telling me that I needed to find out what was happening. As I drove in the indicated direction, the voice continued to murmur, now in an almost lamenting tone, as if begging for something. It was a mix of desperation and warning, something that made me even more anxious. With each mile I traveled, the feeling that I was about to discover something terrible increased. Finally, the coordinates led me to a side road, an almost hidden trail among the dense trees. I followed the narrow, winding path, feeling my heart race with every turn. When I finally saw what the coordinates were pointing to, my blood ran cold. In front of me, among the trees, was an overturned truck, old and rusted, as if it had been there for years. But what really terrified me was the sound coming from inside the truck's cab. The same voice on the radio, still whispering, but now calling the name of the next trucker who would pass through there. I parked the truck with trembling hands. The sight of the overturned vehicle ahead, partially covered by vegetation and with rusted paint from the passage of time, filled me with a terror I couldn't describe. The forest around seemed to close in even more, as if the trees were conspiring to hide that place from the rest of the world. The only sound was that of the voice on the radio, now clearer than ever, whispering names I knew I would never forget. I got out of the truck with trembling legs, feeling the weight of the darkness around me. Every step I took towards the overturned truck, the whisper on the radio grew louder, more insistent. When I finally reached the cab, I saw that the door was ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. The air there was cold and heavy, filled with the sensation that something very wrong had happened in that place. I peeked inside the cab and saw the CB radio still on, emitting the same static interspersed with whispers. It was surreal. Time seemed to have stopped for that truck, as if it were frozen in a moment of horror. And then I saw something that made me instinctively recoil. The driver's seat was covered with a thin layer of dust, but there were handprints, as if someone had clung to it desperately. I knew I should leave, but something held me back. It was as if that place had a sinister magnetism, a force pulling me in, demanding that I discover more. Cautiously, I entered the cab, forcing myself to look around. The CB radio kept whispering, now pronouncing the name of another trucker, someone I didn't know, but who was probably on the same road soon. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Something in that abandoned truck, in that voice that seemed alive, told me I wasn't alone. I looked around, expecting to see someone, or something, in the shadows. But all I found was the echo of my own fear. I knew, without a doubt, that this place was haunted by something far more sinister than any urban legend could explain. With a racing heart, I left the cab and ran back to my truck. As I drove away, the CB radio was still whispering, but now the voice seemed more distant, as if it were saying goodbye. As I left the trail and returned to the main road, the silence returned, but the feeling that something had marked me forever didn't disappear. Since then, every time I cross a forest at night, I hear the whisper of that voice, reminding me of the abandoned truck and the name it will call next.